recognize. So you recognize if something goes wrong, you know who to talk to. Okay? So thank you for that. Ron has spoken here a number of times, and he's got a degree in chemistry and microbiology, and he's been in the aerospace for, I think, 35 years or so. He also used to be with CAPS, Creation Association of Puget Sound, and has been speaking on topics to do with creation versus evolution for, I'm going to say, 15 years or so. So he's been very active. So, Ron, come on up and share.
How are we now? Okay, we're good? Okay, good. My computer didn't work tonight with their system, so I might have to look up here from time to time if I can't read it back there, so bear with me. So tonight we're going to be talking about photosynthesis, which is a really neat subject when you get into it. It really shows God's handiwork, and it shows the real struggle that the evolutionary theory has with understanding or explaining how this came about. But first of all, I wanted to ask you, how many folks are farmers here? Any farmers here? Okay, not too many. How many people have gardens? Well, a few of us, right? Well, some of us try, right? Yeah. So every one of you, well, let me ask you another question. How many people ate breakfast this morning or lunch? Well, that's good. How many people are breathing tonight? Okay, well, Dan, you didn't raise your hand. Sorry. Oh, okay. There's one exception always in the audience. Anyway, all of those things, all of those activities we're able to do those things because of, guess what? Photosynthesis. If it wasn't for that, we wouldn't be doing any of those things. We wouldn't be here, and we're going to be talking about that. So let's see if we can start this thing. Oops, I pushed the wrong button already. So we have 3 goals tonight. Even though this is a talk about a science subject, the first important goal and the most valuable and important goal is honoring the Lord, ascribing him glory and honor and power. That's what Paul did when he talked in Romans. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, and namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly perceived in the subject of photosynthesis and other science creation topics, of course. The second is to demonstrate how much God loves and cares for us. Yeah, that's kind of a strange thing to tie to photosynthesis, isn't it? But we're going to see how that's directly tied. And the last subject is to show the evolutionary theory is seriously flawed, has some real lack in credibility when it comes to this subject. So that's kind of our 3 goals for tonight. So photosynthesis, what is it? Everybody's taken science classes in grade school. Some of you are saying you had it in 7th grade, right? We've all taken classes and learned a little bit about what photosynthesis is. It's actually the name is sort of self-explanatory. Photo meaning light, in this case the sun, and synthesis means to what? To make something, to build. And in this case, biochemicals. And we're going to be talking about that in a minute. So we have here kind of a picture of a little diagram of what photosynthesis is, where a plant, we're going to be focusing on green plants. There's a lot of other organisms that do photosynthesis in different styles and methodologies, but we're going to talk about what's most common, green plants, where the sun shines on the plant, it takes in carbon dioxide, it takes in water, takes in minerals from the soil, and it generates oxygen and glucose. Those are the 2 main products of photosynthesis. And it does it for 2 purposes. One, it does it to supply those things for itself. The plant actually has to live, right? It has a metabolism, and it uses the products it makes. Also, for animals and for us. It's very interesting that and we're going to be talking about this, we live because plants are here. If it wasn't for photosynthesis, we wouldn't be here by any shape of imagination at all. So, one of the key things we're going to be talking about is that photosynthesis is like a factory. So when we're talking today, let's think of factories. Factories where you have inputs and then you have products. You have physical factories, right? We also have chemical factories that are going on, and inside the plant, that's what's happening. The photosynthesis process is actually a chemical factory. It takes sunlight, the plant converts that to chemical energy. It creates sugars, namely glucose. Those are used in plant metabolism. It has to have those for its own survival. And the metabolism, it's a large-scale metabolism inside the cell. It makes starches, carbohydrates, amino acids, proteins, enzymes, cellulose, vitamins, DNA, RNA. All of that is the responsibility of the cell structure inside the plant, but it has to have energy in order to do that. And it's really a neat deal because it makes its own energy, which is kind of really interesting. As you heard before, my degree's in chemistry, and one of the kind of the mantras we had in chemistry class at the University of Washington was better living through chemistry. Right? Well, you can think of a lot of chemistry these days that might not be so better. But look around you or think about things. I don't see anything in this room or anything we've experienced today that really doesn't have something to do with chemistry, with chemicals. The chairs you're sitting on are chemicals. The shirt you're wearing are chemicals. The lenses in your glasses are chemicals. The air you're breathing are chemicals. You know, the cells in your structure in your body, your muscles, are all chemicals. Everything is chemicals. Can anybody think of something physical that's not chemicals? I can't. Anything you think about. So chemistry seems to be kind of important, doesn't it? Just a little bit. Well, that's because everything, all of life, actually rides on chemicals in the chemical process. But this man, an older biochemist named A.E. Wilder Smith, said one time that life indeed rides on chemistry because everything in our cells, in our body, runs on chemistry. Photosynthesis is chemistry. Everything physical in our bodies and living structures is chemistry. But he made the point that life is not chemistry. It's kind of like life rides on chemistry. Does that make sense? Because just chemicals are they're just chemicals. They're things. But there's something about living systems. I watched my wife pass away about 5 years ago. And after she died, the physical was still there. It was pretty obvious. But something was gone. The thing that was riding on the chemistry that made her her was no longer there. And it's interesting, I think God was responsible for that whole thing, that life rides on chemistry. He created a mechanism to carry life, and then he made the processes that are integrated in that, but the life was something on top of it. Remember, God said, in the Bible it says, God breathed the breath of life into man, and he became what? A living being. So the life that's riding on the chemistry is not chemistry, but it's integrated with the chemistry. And that's because this person, our Savior, our Christ, the God of the universe, did that. That's the way he structured it. So what we're going to be doing tonight is studying one of those processes. This verse is really a kind of a neat verse. I found this when I was working on this study. This means a lot to me, and I think if you read this with me, you'll see. For thus says the Lord, who created the heavens, he is God, who formed the earth and he made it. He established it. 1, he did not create it in chaos. 2, he formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord and there's none other. Notice he said two key things here. This verse says he did not create it in chaos. And he created it, he formed it to be what? Inhabited. That's very important. So what does chaos mean? Well, in terms of photosynthesis in plants, our world would look like this if it wasn't for photosynthesis. You guys recognize that? That's in front of Mount St. Helens right after the landslide. And there was zero life there. That's the way our entire world would look if God had not built in processes that would foster and encourage life. I'm thankful he did, aren't you? Kind of cool. I'm glad. What does inhabited mean? Well, flourishing life everywhere on our planet. Everywhere you look. Plants provide everything we need, everything needed to sustain animal and human life. Did you know plants are the only organisms that can produce their own food? Have you ever thought about that? What did somebody have for breakfast this morning? Anybody? Oatmeal. Where does that come from? Oats. Plants. Photosynthesis. Anybody have sausage for breakfast? I did. Guess where that comes from? Plants that the animal ate, that I ate. Does that make sense? Everything we are, you guys cannot produce your own food. Did you know that? If it wasn't for plants, guess what? It would look like in the front of Mount St. Helens. No life. Think about that. If it wasn't for plants, we wouldn't have any food because we cannot manufacture our own food. We cannot manufacture glucose to provide the energy for our metabolism. It comes from, guess, plants, using the process of photosynthesis. It's very interesting. You see, some of my favorite plants and animals are really a result of photosynthesis. I like guppies. They're one of my favorites. And marigolds is my favorite flower. I'm not sure about that guy over there. And I used to work on a farm when I was a kid. Okay? Here's the key question, key comment. It's all because of that chemical factory, photosynthesis. Remember we talked about being a factory. You remember that term. Plants provide so many fundamental things needed for our flourishing. Not only ours, but animals. You know, there's just a list. You know, whoops, wrong deal here, wrong button. You know, there's chemical energy, glucose, maintains safe carbon dioxide levels, amino acids, vitamins, lipids, oils, fats, roughage for digestion, medicines, habitat, and building materials. This building would not be here if it wasn't for plants and photosynthesis. Erosion control, weather stability, animal life for food, like food chain, nutrients for the soil, yeah, and the list goes on. All because of plants and photosynthesis. And God knew that, and He did it. He made that process, that requirement for plants being involved on purpose. This verse is really cool. And God said, this was about the fourth commandment He gave in Genesis after He made Adam and Eve. Behold, I have given you every, what? Plant. You shall have them for food, to every beast and to every bird of the air and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life. I have given every what? Green plant. Operating on the process of photosynthesis. That was His fourth commandment, to eat what? Plants. This is I think it's kind of important, don't you think? This is before the 10 Commandments. So, when He first started out, animals the moose, the bear, even people there. See the lady behind the bush? We were designed and instructed to eat plants. Plants. Okay? Then there was a problem, the fall. Guess what? The system changed. Animals now began to eat animals. Anybody have a moose burger before? It's really good. Bears eat moose. That's kind of interesting. Did you know that some people eat bear? Anybody ever bear meat? I never have. Some of it's good, isn't it? If it's prepared right. And the guy wasn't eating in the garbage. Well, the unfortunate thing is that also happens sometimes. All because of the fall. That's not the way God set it up originally. Remember, he said, I give you every what? Green plant. Not each other. But that's what happened in the fall. Let's think about this. How did this all come about? Think about this. Think about how this all started. How did God initiate this? Well, start with a question. Do horses fly? How many say yes? Absolutely. Well, some do. Don't they? So, is this statement true? How many would say absolutely? How many say impossible? Improbable? Okay, I'd like to hear your reason why, because what you have to do to answer that question is to apply critical thinking and logic to what? Science and reality. How many of you ever seen a horse fly? There's a reason why. It wasn't designed to do that. They don't fly. However, John thinks it might be possible because he has either a need for that or a hope or he has an agenda, doesn't he? But in fact, if you evaluate it against science and reality, it doesn't fly. No pun intended. So how does photosynthesis fit into the evolutionary picture? Well, I'm sort of like, I like math equations, so here we go. Hold on to your hat. Nothing turned into everything. That's the first step in evolution, isn't it? Now, this is very top level, so bear with me. Well, something plus chemical chance interaction turned into energy conversion system inside plants. Isn't that convenient? That's really cool. However, it gets really complicated because those two independent things are now intricately integrated together in a system inside the plants. Apply our science and reality now. Think about this. Well, let's go on. Something to the first animals. Well, again, we have the stuff eventually turned into animal life. We're not going to talk about that today. It's got its own issues, very similar issues. So let's assume we have animal life. Well, microbes to man. You got time, energy. Now you got animal life and you got plants, right? That's pretty convenient. Because then you apply chance, mutational changes, a sexual reproductive engine to pass on the genes, a little bit of natural selection, and guess what? You get man. That's pretty cool. We're back right here. It's really interesting that the metabolism for plants, guess what, is exactly the same metabolism for animals. Did you know that? We both have mitochondria. We both generate and make proteins and DNAs and such like that. Very, very interesting. I'm really thankful that's true. That was a really big random chance, wasn't it? That just happened. Well, what happens? Why is it so critical? If you don't have photosynthesis, you don't have plants, do you? If you don't have plants, no oxygen, no food. And if you don't have any of that, guess what? We're toast. Well, literally almost, aren't we? Now to think about it. That's all you have is toast. There's a gentleman named Charles Darwin that said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ, or in this case, process like photosynthesis, which existed, which could not have been possibly formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. You remember all those sequential processes in those equations? How they were all interrelated and started out from nothing to go to something? Sounds like, whoops, too many things again. You got to ask the question, and that's the question. Can it be demonstrated that photosynthesis could have possibly been formed by numerous successive slight modifications and be compatible with plant and animal metabolism? Think about that. And here's the great tragedy of science, the slaying of a beautiful hypothesis, quote unquote, evolution, by an ugly fact. Is that statement true? How do you know? Well, you got to apply critical thinking and logic to what? Science and reality. And that's what we're here to do tonight. But you can make a choice that it is absolutely possible if you have one of those three things on the right-hand side, can't you? Well, I think, Houston, we have a problem. Evolution says if you have enough time, even the most irreducibly complex organism or process like photosynthesis could possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications. That's what it says, right? Well, photosynthesis says you really don't know how chemistry operates in the real world. And that's one of the key things we want to talk about tonight. And what I want you to remember, one of the key takeaways. Chemistry doesn't operate like that. And as a result, just as a side issue, long ages are no longer a factor. Why? Well, this is the first theme that I want you to remember. The first takeaway. Just like Huxley said, the ugly fact is, you ready for this? Drum roll. Chemicals are kind of dumb. Did you know that? Anybody ever hear that before? To a group of kids, I phrased it a little bit differently. I said, dirt is dumb when it comes to evolution. Here's the reason why. Chemicals react specifically and predictably, but with no intended purpose or direction. They always do. And they always will. Chemicals do not organize themselves spontaneously or randomly to form complicated, integrated chemical factories like photosynthesis. They just do not do that. And you know, I know a little bit about that. When I was in high school, I learned about chemistry for the first time, and my buddy Doug and I, we decided we were going to be really smart and we're going to go make nitroglycerin. This was really we just were really excited about that. This is in Pasco. So we decided we were going to be real smart with all our chemical knowledge. And we got our acids together and we got glycerin and we went out in the desert and we mixed them together. And guess what happened? We didn't get nitroglycerin. You know what we got? We got that. We got a great big cloud of red gas. And I didn't know it then, but that was a severely, very, very poisonous cloud of NO2. If we were in the wrong direction, we probably I wouldn't be standing here. This was not a good plan. It didn't work out how we planned it. There's a reason why, and I'm going to tell you about that. Basically, we mixed the chemicals together, and they did exactly what they were designed to do in those conditions, under those situations, in those concentrations, and how we put it together. They did exactly what they do naturally, but not purposely. Does that make sense? Okay, 2 years later, I got a little bit smarter after 2 years of college chemistry. And I wanted to use this compound right here to do another chemical process that I wanted to study. This was when I was a sophomore. It's called cyclononanone. Well, it's not really complex, but it's a very expensive molecule. And he said, if you want to do this, you got to make your starting compounds. I'm not going to buy it for you, so go for it. So after 3 days, this is an extract out of my paper that I wrote describing this. Whoops, gosh, I just go too fast with that thing. After 3 days of doing that, guess what? It worked. I got exactly what I intended to get. Now, what was the difference between 1969 and 1971? What changed? This reaction is like 10,000 times more complex than the other one in high school. What was the difference? Intelligence. It's the guy who was running the experiment. Because I learned how chemicals react together in certain circumstances, and I designed the reaction just the way I wanted it to be to get what I wanted. And guess what? It worked after 3 days, not 3 minutes like the other reaction was. So you remember, chemicals are dumb. They just do what they do. And it's how they're used that's important, not how they operate. And guess what? God made those chemicals, and I think he knows how they work. Don't you? That's exactly the point. So that was fact one, the ugly fact. This is the other ugly fact. Photosynthesis is a designed, complicated, integrated, what? Chemical factory to supply energy to living systems. It's not just a pile of stuff inside a little container that you mix together randomly. It was designed to do what it does, and it does it very well. Because the chief master chemist was at his best. And he had you in mind, and me in mind. What does it mean that it's a designed, complicated, integrated chemical factory? And how does that fly in the face of evolutionary dogma? Well, here's an example. How many of you like baked bread? This is really good stuff with hot and butter on it, and I like strawberry jam. So there you go. So how many of you made bread before? Okay? Pretty simple process, isn't it, really? You just kind of get your ingredients together. Whoops, sorry. Up here, you mix it together with some water. You knead it. You let it rise. You bake it, and yum, yum, right? Pretty simple, isn't it? Not too hard. I could probably even do it. Well, maybe not. I don't know. So it is a simple process, isn't it? But where did the flour come from that you used in number one? No, think immediate. Where did it come from? Pillsbury. Well, you bought it from Safeway or Fred Meyer's or something. Pillsbury, right? Okay. Well, I had to get down to Fred Meyer and get it, didn't it? Well, it's a little bit more complicated, but not too bad. Well, where did the flour come from? Well, this factory, get that word? Factory, somewhere back east, Pillsbury plant. Very complicated process. But it's well known, they do a good job at it. Getting a little bit more complicated, you're baking bread? Well, they had to get the wheat to the mill, didn't they? That seems like a little bit more input into your bread making process, isn't it? Getting a little bit more complicated, would you say? Well, where did they get it? Well, they got it from granaries that store the wheat, right? Well, now it's getting a little bit more complicated. I ran a combine in an old machine like that in 1965 before I graduated from high school. That's me out in the field in Dayton, Washington. That took a lot of work, being on a farm, to harvest the grain that was at the granary that gets transported to the Pillsbury plant that gets into your flour. So if it wasn't for me sitting there, you guys wouldn't be making bread, would you? Well, these days it's a little bit easier and a little bit better. This is a picture of my niece's combine, one of her 3 of them, that they farm in 8,000 acres in Dayton, Washington. It's really cool. They're fun to ride on. But if it wasn't for them, you wouldn't be getting the grain. Well, it even goes deeper. See those tires? They're made by Goodyear rubber. What happens to that combine if those tires go flat?
Goes very slowly.
What?
It goes very slowly.
Goes very slowly, and your bread making process comes to a what? Halt. Well, wait a second. Do tires have anything to do with bread making? What if, well, where are the Goodyear tires made? They're in a Goodyear factory, right? Well, we're not going to, we could go back forever on this. A rubber tree. What happens to the whole process of making bread if the Goodyear tire company stops making tires? Has anybody ever thought about that when you're making bread? Is this a complicated process of making bread? You bet you it is. Way more complicated than you know, because you just go down to the store and buy the stuff, right? Well, now think about that when it comes to photosynthesis. There's even a more complicated factory ahead of the combine. One, you start with growing brand new fresh wheat. Sorry about the condition of this, I forgot to water it. And we're going to talk about this. It does not look very good, does it? Normally it's bright green like that. Next time I do this, I'm going to water it before I come, okay? But this is wheat grass. This is what wheat looks like after it's planted and sprouts up. And then it grows and he gets the heads on it where the grain is, and down here is the finished product ready for the combine. Does that make sense? This is all part of your factory making your bread, by the way. If this does not happen, you're back to square one. So it's not really a simple process, is it? So, what about this photosynthetic process? It even gets more complicated. Now, I want to give you a warning. What we're going to get into now is very complicated. And I expect you to remember almost nothing of it, okay? Even though we're going to have a test at the end, and you have to leave your wallet if you don't pass, you can just skip this part and don't try to remember this. The objective is to see how complicated it is. Does that make sense? So don't expect to remember it unless you're like really weird, okay? So inside the cell is a, whoops, gosh, I go too fast in this thing, is a little structure called a chloroplast. Maybe you've heard of that. There's also other things in the cell that are normal, mitochondria, nucleus, Golgi bodies, etc. Those are the same type of things that are in our cells, by the way. The thing that the plant has that we don't have is this. Okay? And that's where photosynthesis is done. This is a picture of those chloroplasts in moss leaf. There's about 10 or 12 of them in here, or 8 or something like that. They get about to 50 per cell or something like that. That's the typical average. They're a little tiny green little box, they're a little, cell of some kind. This is kind of a big cross section of it. It's made of see where it is? It comes from the, over here. It's a blow up of, this is the cell wall of the chloroplast itself. These are called thylakoid discs, and I'm going to call them green pancakes, okay? Green pancakes are stacked on top of each other, and they're the ones that contain the chlorophyll, which is key in photosynthesis. Okay, got that? So little green pancakes. This is a picture of the typical chlorophyll molecules. There's 2 of them, A and B, and there's a dozen of different kinds, depending on the plant. Do those look simple chemicals? They're pretty complicated, aren't they? The only difference is the 2 things that are circled, but they act way differently. They're very complicated. Well, this is a picture of a graph showing that the chlorophyll absorbs light at different wavelengths at the one end of the spectrum and the other end of the spectrum. And the reason why plants are green is because in the green area of the wavelength of light, it doesn't absorb any energy from the light. And therefore it looks green. That's why green plants are green. This is not rocket science, although it is science. You see the little wavelength thing here? The reds and yellows and the violets and blues, it absorbs, but the greens, nah. I think green is God's favorite color, don't you? Okay, so remember the green pancakes? The sunshine shines on the plant, and the light is absorbed into the chloroplast into the little green pancakes where the chlorophyll is. Okay? Now here is the complicated area where you're not going to remember. In just a second, sorry. There's two parts. One is called the light process, where sunlight is converted to chemical energy. The second part is called the dark part of photosynthesis, where the sugars are made. There are two separate factories inside photosynthesis. Is it getting simpler? Not really. Okay, here it is. This is where you're going to lose it. This is a picture of inside the green pancakes, outside the green pancakes. With me? Okay? The first step in photosynthesis is where sunlight hits this molecule complex where the chlorophyll is. And it generates, whoops, let me go back. That's where it hits, and it generates an electron that is stolen from the chlorophyll. See that E minus there? That's an electron. And then that electron, and we'll see how that moves along here, but just a second. So we're still on step one. And this is a picture of what they think that first complex looks like. There's about 80 to 90 chemicals inside there, carotenes and quinones, and there's the chlorophyll A. There's some enzymes down here. It's very complicated, would you say? Really simple compound? No, very complex. That's the chlorophyll A. Sunlight hits up there on those carotenes and other compounds. The vibrational energy is transferred down to the chlorophyll. An electron is ejected. And by the way, the chlorophyll loses an electron, right? And guess what happens to the chlorophyll after it loses an electron? It's dead chemically. So what happens is there's an enzyme down here that takes water and it steals electrons from the high oxygen and makes oxygen for us to breathe. That's down here. H2O is broken into oxygen and hydrogen atoms. And the electrons from the oxygen are given back to the chlorophyll to replenish it so that it can do it again and again and again and again. That's why you have to water your plant. Because if you don't, guess what's going to happen to photosynthesis? It's going to stop and the plant will die like these are dying. Okay? Is that simple? Or is it complex? Okay. Step two is where the electron here moves to the second group of chemicals here, and it pumps hydrogens from outside to inside. Just as a note, that's its job. Step three, the electron is now lost all of its energy doing this, and so it goes over to here to this third section, and another zap of light comes in and inserts energy into the electron to a higher energy state, because it's lost all its energy doing the hydrogen transfer. You got it? I see you're just eating this up. Okay? So what it does then, that electron that's now gone from here to here, goes up here and it hooks onto this little chemical here and forms this chemical called NADPH. And that's the first product of photosynthesis. It's an energy molecule. Keep that in your mind. Then it goes on to step 4. Remember those hydrogens that are filling up down here? This compound, which is a very complicated protein enzyme called ATP synthase, pumps the hydrogens back outside and steals the energies from the hydrogens and makes that compound right there ATP. So we got now 2 energy molecules from the sunlight through a bunch of complicated chemistry here. Is this complicated? You guys got all this down? Can I go to the next slide and so you'll remember it? Okay? So you got to remember that a whole bunch of factories, little factories inside the green plant cake that take energy and create these 2 chemicals right here. And then when those chemicals are done outside the pancakes, it goes into the dark phase. It's called the Calvin cycle. And that's all the purpose of the light side. That's all the purpose of sunlight, is to create these 2 chemicals right here. Okay? Those are the 2 chemicals. Are those simple looking chemicals? No, they just happen to be laying around, right? No, I think they were intended that way. These go into part 2 of photosynthesis, the dark side, where there's no light. It's called the Calvin cycle. Does this look simple? No, it's not. Part 2 is making sugars for plant metabolism. You got your energy molecules now. Now you got to make the sugars. We're in part 2 of the big factory. So you start up here with this chemical. I'm not going to name it. You add carbon dioxide to it. You go over here and you see all these molecules over. These are the energy molecules now. It combines those through a series of steps. Whoops, I just pressed the button too much. Step 3 down here to make glucose. And then part of these chemicals go back up and regenerate this, and you get this cycle that keeps going like this. It's a little machine that goes round and around and around, using your energy molecules here and here that you made in part 1 of the photosynthesis. Is that simple? A lot of integrated factories, aren't there? Inside that, inside the Calvin cycle, inside that driving all this, is a single enzyme called ribosco enzyme. That's got hundreds and hundreds of amino acids all tied together. Does that look like a simple compound? Huh? Yes or no? No, it doesn't. It just happened to be there. Well, maybe it didn't just happen to be there. So, just to summarize, here's a picture of the chloroplast. The first step in the green pancakes is to take light and make our 2 energy molecules, right? Then, as a side, you get some oxygen for us to breathe, and for the plant to use, by the way. And the CO2 is used in the dark side to make sugars, which is the energy molecule that the cells can use. By the way, most people think that the oxygen comes from the carbon dioxide in photosynthesis, right? You've heard that? Well, that's not true. Where does it come from? It comes from the water that we needed those electrons so the water breaks down to form the oxygen. Isn't that interesting? Just a little side note. So, the buttons are too close together. So the sugars that were made and the oxygen that was made in the chloroplast in the plant are then used in the plants to provide energy for its processes. Remember, the plant makes food for itself, doesn't it? And it creates CO2 and oxygen. Did you know that this is the same process in your cells? We eat the sugars and breathe in the oxygen, and our mitochondria uses that for our respiration inside our cells to make our materials we need. It's the same process with the same type of little organism. Oops, excuse me. So, the chloroplast makes chemical energy, or energy chemicals, in order for the cell to make the chloroplast. Do you see a problem here? Doesn't that like a circular process? Like the chloroplast makes the energy for the cell to make the chloroplast. That sounds like a chicken and egg problem to me. Would you agree that photosynthesis is a designed, complicated, integrated chemical factory? How many people say yes? Can anybody get up here and share with me the entire process? Well, that's okay. You can forget all that stuff, because this is the important thing right here. I wanted to show you that and prove to you that it's really complicated. Making bread is not really simple, because this is also a precursor to you making bread. And how does process fly in the face of evolutionary dogma? Basically because chemicals are dumb. Does that make sense? They're not designed to function with a plan themselves. They have to have a designer from the outside. So, like a Goodyear tire on a combine, if there's one amino acid missing in any one of those enzymes, forget photosynthesis. It has to be all complete, functioning in the right chemical order, in the right factories from the get-go. The functioning photosynthesis supplies energy to the plant's metabolism, but the plant's metabolism forms and sustains photosynthesis. Therein lies the dilemma. Which came first? It's an all or nothing deal. If any of these problems happens, no energy, no plants, no life. It seems that the evolutionary process for photosynthesis is what? It's really dead on arrival, because chemicals are dumb. Either the evolutionary theory needs to be revised or perhaps just scrapped. So that is their answer to how it came about. The evolutionary community has no idea how photosynthesis came about, because it's an integrated, complicated factory where the building blocks are dumb. Here's a little comic that I really like that describes what I think evolution is like. Garfield, the very first cat, crawled out of the sea about 10 million years ago. Fortunately for him, it was only about another 15 minutes before the first mouse crawled out. That's kind of what we're talking about. Fortunately for the evolutionary theory, simple chemicals form complex integrated biochemicals contrary to the chemical science. Plants evolved first, and then in another 15 minutes, animals evolved with complementary mechanisms of all things. That's amazing. They're two separate organisms. We got another level of complexity here that just happened. Here's an interesting animal, and we're done with the science part. This is a sea slug that has an interesting life cycle. The babies are just regular sea slugs. They eat plants. But when they eat plants, they digest the plants, but they keep the chloroplasts. They don't digest the chloroplasts. Isn't that interesting? What do they do with the chloroplasts? They integrate them into their digestive system. There are chemicals that they're born with, proteins, that allow that to happen. And the chloroplasts continue to function. Because remember, they don't have blood vessels going to them and stuff like that. All they need is light and a right environment to work, and chloroplasts will work. And the sea slugs, for probably up to a year, use the chloroplasts that they eat when they're little tiny babies. So, is this a plant or an animal? A plantable. That's a good idea. I never thought about that. Thank you. A plantable. Talk about integration. That goes one step beyond even what we were talking about before. I think God had something to do with this one too. Well, takeaways. 1, chemicals are kind of dumb. Do you get that thing? Say that with me. Chemicals are dumb. They're kind of dumb. They don't form complicated chemical factories by themselves. Photosynthesis is a designed, complicated, integrated chemical factory supplying energy to living systems, plants themselves, animals, and you and me. I think those are pretty cool. I think God had something to do with that. I don't think evolutionary ideas had anything to do with it because chemicals are dumb. So, how about our faith in relation to what we just talked about? Is it rational and reasonable to believe God, not unknown events, created photosynthesis? Fully functional to facilitate a flourishing world, not in chaos, but to be inhabited. Does that seem logical to you guys? It kind of does to me. It makes a lot more sense. It looks like it was designed to do what it does. Man, back to this basic verse that we started with. He did not create it in chaos. He formed it to be habited. I am the Lord, and there is no other. That's the important part. Lord, thank you for that, huh? He formed it to be inhabited so we could have a relationship with him. Isn't that why he made us? Isn't that why he made the world? That's why Jesus came to reestablish our relationship with us. His whole physical world that he set up, photosynthesis and everything else, was designed so that we could inhabit it and have a relationship with him. It was his idea in the first place. And he's smart. He's the master chemist, and he was able to do it. God gave us plants to thrive physically, and God gave us the bread of life to survive spiritually, didn't he? I like this verse. Have you received Jesus, the bread of life, for yourself? And just as it is appointed for men to die once, and after that comes the judgment. So Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to what? Save those who are eagerly waiting for him. He wants a relationship. He built a physical world, and now he's building a spiritual world for us. Jesus died for us on the cross to take the penalty for our sin and rebellion against God, and was raised from the dead so we could have a new life in fellowship with God. Are you guys waiting? Am I waiting on Christ for this? Okay? This is our task, to understand the world he made for us. Photosynthesis being one of them. Chemicals are dumb. God is the master chemist, and he did it because he wants a relationship with us. And he made a world where we could flourish, physically and spiritually. So when we think about these things, remember evaluating a question? Can it happen by accident? We apply critical thinking and logic to what? Science and reality. I like these two verses. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to put confidence in evolutionary theory. That's what it really says, among other things. Psalm 111:2, this is my latest verse I'm working on. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all those who have pleasure in them. That's what I love doing, these kind of things. Whoops, I went one too far. Last one. Daniel 1:4. Daniel and his 3 friends were trained so they would be skillful in wisdom and cunning in knowledge and understanding what? Photosynthesis, right? Science. So, I'm done. Before we go any further, be sure to get a hold of me if you want a trip, because we'll do that to Dry Falls. And I can arrange a trip to Mount St. Helens also. Questions? Do we have a few minutes?
Yeah. Let's give Ron a hand. He did very well to make up for lost time there.
What time is it?
We got a few minutes yet. So if you have a question, put up your hand. I'll come around with a mic so people can
By the
hear.
way, I have a question for you. Do you remember all that complicated chemistry?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I'll bring up the slides and reference them. All right. Questions? Yeah.
If we wanted to go on one of the trips, could we just join in with another group that's already going?
If it works out.
Yeah,
October,
so
you'd have to call me and arrange it.
just a couple people.
That would be
join
fine.
in.
That would be a good way to do it.
Yeah, yeah.
If you had just a couple people. I encourage you, though, if you're going to do this, get with your youth group, your pastor, your friends, homeschool group, and especially bring a group of young kids with, because that's what it's really for.
Okay.
In all this,
Use your microphone.
Where's the bees? The bees came into the equation.
Oh, the bees?
The bees.
Oh,
the
yes.
Polo.
Yeah, for fertilization. Yeah,
Yes, yes.
Yeah, transfer pollen to.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's another complicated system all by itself. It's another part of the overall factory of the flower, because bees and other insects and other types of animals need to, if you will, transfer the pollen to the stamen in the plant, especially flowering plants, for example, in order for the seeds to form, in order for them to reproduce. Now we're getting into the reproductive cycle, which is an independent factory, and it's not directly related to the energy systems we're talking about, photosynthesis. But without the photosynthesis providing the energy, it wouldn't be able to do the things that the growth of the seed and all that stuff. And the structure of the flower is produced from the energy from photosynthesis, but it's not directly related. But if that doesn't happen, there's going to be no photosynthesis in the next generation. So it's all integrated together like that. And that in itself is a massive chemical process inside the reproductive system. Good question.
There are some plants, like orchids, that can fix their own nitrogen, and it seems to be a more complex process. Do evolutionists think that came before or after? It seems like creating your own nitrogen would be a more complex process added to the photosynthesis. Well,
and that's because typically you're talking about legumes. You're talking about the bees assisting in pollination. Bacteria in the root structure of some plants take nitrogen from the air and create nitrogen, or nitrates, which is fertilizer, kind of self-fertilization. But that involves another organism that's symbiotic with what?
I did not know there were bacteria.
Yes, it's a bacterial process. Plants don't do it themselves.
Wow. That's missing in the textbook.
Well, there are some weird plants out there, I have to admit, that do some strange things. But generally speaking, that's what happens.
Okay, other questions you might have? Ron, of course, will be at the tables as well if you want to ask him some other questions. So if not, let me bring this to a close. I just have a few comments to make. Again, thank you for your patience, and we got Ron got it through. And if you want to catch it again, remember it is available on our YouTube channel on our website. Just go to apologeticsforum.org. There's a YouTube icon there. Click on that, and you can listen to it there as well. So next month, as I said, we have Dr. Frank Sherwin. He's with ICR. That's the Institute of Creation Research. That's one of the original creation organizations founded by Henry Morris, Dr. Henry Morris, who has now passed on to glory, of course, but that was started a long time ago. And that organization still runs in Dallas, Texas. So Dr. Sherwin, he's a scientist, and he does a lot of the writing. Some of the books that ICR has produced, many of those on ocean, zoology, all kinds of animals, he's written those for ICR. And when he comes, he will bring some of those books with him that you can purchase here. So he's been working for ICR, I think, for probably more than 20 years at this point. And he's one of their most sought-after speakers. He's a very good dynamic speaker, and he covers stuff very well. All the topics that he's going to cover, again, you can reference his schedule. I've got a copy on the back table there. It looks like this. But you can also, of course, get that on our website, apologeticsforum.org, and print that out, take it with you, and invite others to some of these talks. He's going to be speaking 9 different times here over those 5 days, so we've got him very busy. So he's going to speak on scientific evidence for creation. What scientific evidence do we have? And he's going to look at evidence in the terms of microorganisms or microscope, and also the large picture, telescope, and also looking at animals, the macro world, and look at them and see that they are designed. They didn't just happen by chance. So he's going to be here then Friday night. There's a one-page flyer for that back there too. And then Saturday morning, he's going to be at another church in Arlington, the First Baptist Church of Arlington. And that's a morning, what we call a mini conference. Well, he will give 2 lectures on the topic of design. The earth is designed for life, and he'll give 2 examples of that. For the youth, we have a youth night, and that's at a different church in Arlington. The topic there is going to be what your science textbooks don't teach you. The science textbooks in the secular schools, of course, are all about evolution, but there are many questions that they don't answer, and that's what Dr. Sherman is going to cover. Okay, so that's the plan, and I'll be sending out emails reminding you of what he's going to be speaking out, when and where. And you can also find this information on the website. So just in summary, there's books. Actually, we have mostly DVDs this time in the back tables. Take a look at those and see what is of interest. Next time we're here, we'll have more books available as well. There are some refreshments in the back there. Take advantage of that. And if you have any questions, you can ask Ron or ask me or any of the board members questions you might have about Apologetics Forum. And remind you, the way we support this is through donations. If you care to donate, there are 2 boxes in the back where you can just drop off either just cash or checks, whatever you like. Checks should be written out to Apologetics Forum. And so we appreciate your support, and next time we'll have the equipment working perfectly. So let me just close in a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we come to you just to thank you for this time. We thank you for the knowledge that Ron Payne has transmitted to us, and we are convinced, of course, that you did design all these organisms, the living organisms, the animals, the plants, and the mechanisms to keep them alive. And we thank you for that you've given us the evidence for that. We thank you for the ministry, and we pray just bless